Hello everyone and welcome back to our 10th and final unit of the year. This unit is called Politics in Modern American Society, and basically we are going to pick up from the 1960s all the way through current day. We have seen a very transformative period of American history over the last 40 years. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that in this unit. We're going to start with picking up where we left off in our Cold War unit. We're going to revisit the Nixon administration, and specifically we're going to identify some of the things he did during his years as president, including the Watergate scandal, one of the worst presidential scandals of all time. We'll move on into the Ford and Carter and Reagan years, and then we'll wrap up by talking about the last 25 years or so, with starting with Clinton, and then both, Bush and Clinton, and then we'll visit 9/11. We'll see what happened on that tragic day in American history, and work all the way up to our current day. This is perhaps the most relevant unit that we'll study because things are so recent in terms of what we're studying. So I hope you guys enjoyed this unit. Let's go ahead and get started here. So politics in modern American society. You can probably tell from the cover page here, some of the items we're going to be talking about. It gets a little wild when it comes to the counterculture era. So that's where we're going to pick up, the 1960s counterculture. We had talked in our Cold War unit about the tragedy of Vietnam, and that sparked a tremendous change in America. It's starting out with the kind of the protest movement, but that turned into a whole nother counterculture movement in and of itself that pushed back against traditional ways. So we're going to see that clash take place here and look at some of the effects that it had. So what we're describing is what becomes known as the New Left, and this is really a youth-dominated focus. And you're probably familiar with the term hippies and all that. That is kind of a part of this this mentality of kind of against the older generations and against the traditional mindset in terms of both how we live our lives, but also in terms of the relationship between the government and the people. So we're seeing a tremendous change, and a lot of this is very visible change. Like I mentioned, hippie culture, you just look at the types of clothing that is being worn, much different from any generation before that. The music that is being heard is much different. Of course, rock and roll kind of got its start earlier on in the 1950s, but by the 1960s, it's really kind of become something completely different. The Beatles really made it an international sensation when they came over from England and really, propelled rock into mainstream America. So we see music is starting to change. We're seeing, the center point, really, of kind of the whole '60s, the apex of this generation. Most people point to Woodstock, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It was a music festival that brought in over 100,000 people, primarily young people who came to see some of the top acts of the day, including Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead. All of these were playing at Woodstock, and like I said, it really did come to symbolize a lot of this kind of free love, this free, this mentality that had developed in the 1960s. This became the penultimate event. Were you at Woodstock? It became, a bragging right if you were in attendance at this music festival, and it got completely out of hand. Ultimately, there were almost 500,000 people that showed up, and it became, like I said, kind of the center point of the 1960s. Now, I always laugh at this stock photo because it's a little ridiculous, but the type of clothing that is being worn by people in this generation, which I should quick time out, just because your grandparents were alive in the 60s does not mean that they were a hippie. So don't go to family dinner and start asking them whether they were included in this. This was definitely a minority, but this was an emergence of a group in society we just really hadn't seen before. So Again, the colorful appearance, the tie-dye, the long hair, as the slide says here, this is very symbolic of kind of the freedom of the era, of do your own thing. If it makes you feel good and happy, then go for it. Now that didn't mean that there wasn't some side effects. So you know, there are negative consequences to doing whatever you want, as I'm sure some of you have found out by choosing not to do assignments for me. No, just kidding. Everyone, right? You guys have kept up with it. It's sadly in the 1960s we also see the introduction of major drug use in the United States, and frankly, we see the counterculture also kind of give into new ideas on sex and what you know, the relationship should be like. So that, again, that didn't mean that there weren't consequences for that, because drug addiction will start to rise during this period. We're going to see an intense focus on penalties against drug users, and frankly, this is the beginning of the prison problem that we have today, where we have you know, a lot of overpopulated prisons, many of which are based off of drug incidences. So, and even with the sexual revolution that's happening, you know, there's a rise of STDs. You know, all these things have consequences, but they do become symbolic of this counterculture era. Now, at the tail end of this, you also see kind of the rise of a new kind of wave of the civil rights movement, and you know, we talked about in our civil rights unit about how women were active, especially like in the Freedom Summer and as freedom riders. We're going to see the spark here in the 1970s of the women's rights movement, also known as the feminist movement. A lot of this was defined by a woman named Betty Friedan, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique that challenged a lot of the views and kind of the status quo of what women's roles were in America. You know, up to this point, you know, I always think back to the sitcoms of the 1950s, you know, I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver, all these shows which often portray women, you know, at home in the work, you know, not in the workplace, but at home, you know, raising the kids, you know, cooking and cleaning. This was kind of their role, and frankly, and there's nothing wrong with that role, but in the 1970s, women started challenging whether that was the only path that women could have. Was you know, are they all destined to be mothers and wives? You know, so seeking more of an identity outside of those traditional roles. One organization that was formed by Betty Friedan was the National Organization for Women, known by the acronym NOW. And their main goal was to pursue women's goals and equality. 1968, they would protest the Miss America pageant, and quite famously, they would do things like burning their bras, kind of seen as a liberation of sorts. But they even crowned a sheep as Miss America. So they weren't big fans of beauty pageants, but this was an example of you know, one of these protests that the feminist movement pursued, you know, changing that idea of what is acceptable for American women. Now, kind of the peak of the women's liberation movement came in 1973 with the Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade, and this is still a very divisive case today. But what Roe versus Wade decided was that women do have the right to choose to have an abortion within the first 3 months of their pregnancy. Now, I'm not here to say, you know, what is right or wrong on that, but this topic has been, as I said, extremely divisive ever since this moment. And in fact, I'm always reminded of this anytime we add someone to the Supreme Court. One of the main questions they are always asked is, you know, what is your stance on Roe versus Wade? Because there's still talk about maybe even returning to this court case and potentially even overturning it in the future. So, you know, a woman's right to do with her body what she so chooses, you know, that was kind of the feminist viewpoint. But of course, there are a lot of other ethical dilemmas that this raises as well. So it's something that everyone has to kind of decide on their own. Now, it's also during the feminist movement that we're going to see a potential amendment to the Constitution introduced. In 1972, there will be a constitutional amendment introduced to the states called the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, if this amendment had been passed, this would have called for equality, and no one could be discriminated against or denied any kind of privilege based on their sex. So, the ERA, as it became known, it did have a number of states that signed on to it. But ultimately it did fail because not enough states joined in. You do have to have a supermajority that agree to an amendment to the Constitution, and that did not take place. Now, one interesting note is that, and this has just happened within the last few months, is that the state of Virginia, the state government in Virginia, has actually voted to accept the ERA. And that was the last state that was needed to actually push this forward. So we might actually see a return to the ERA sometime even this year. Now, there is some legal questions because this was supposed to happen. States could only, verify their support for the ERA within a certain time period. And legal scholars question, whether that is still available today. So again, you might hear about the ERA in the news coming up because there was that big vote in Virginia, but it may come to pass, it may not. We'll see. Now, one effect that the counterculture had was, frankly, some people started getting tired of it, and there was this concern that if we're throwing out traditional values, that is going to lead our country into a dark place. So, perhaps I've never made this visual for you before, but history and especially politics tends to swing in a pendulum style. You ever seen one of those big grandfather clocks that has a pendulum in the center of it that swings back and forth? Well, that's definitely the story of history because at times we are very conservative and at other times we are very liberal. So the 1960s was a very liberal time period. Again, not everyone, but we start to see that push in the 60s. In the 70s, you're going to start to see the pendulum swing back to the right, and we're going to see a return to conservatism, especially in some of the viewpoints of the politicians that are running during this time. And frankly, this is going to lead to perhaps the most conservative time period in our nation's history, and that is the 1980s. So let's take a look at who this, we had the new left to begin in the 1960s. What we're going to see in the 1970s is the emergence of a new right, and these are conservatives that are focused on traditional values, moral issues, and they said the things like gratuitous sex and drug use. Those things are wrong. We need to push back against that. It's not okay to do whatever you want. That's going to lead to harm in society and to individuals. So kind of a return to focus on conservative values. Now, Richard Nixon really took hold of this issue and is going to kind of become one of the early poster childs of this conservative movement. In 1968, he is going to run for president again. We saw him run in 1960 versus John F. Kennedy and fail, a very close election there. But Nixon is going to run again for the Republicans in 1968. And there are two main pieces of his platform. Number one, the war in Vietnam is going very poorly by 1968, and so he does offer some solutions for that. Not only ultimately a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam, which does happen, but kind of what's called a Vietnamization of that war, in which he urges the Vietnamese to take control of the conflict themselves. So that's his first platform. Let's get out of Vietnam. And that is one that definitely rings positively for both conservatives and liberals at this time. The war is not going well, as I said, so that's going to be a major point of this election. And number two, I want to remind you that the last decade has been very tumultuous, not only over the war in Vietnam and a lot of protests, but also the civil rights era, which you did see a lot of confrontation and a lot of violence. And even though many of the protests we discussed were peaceful, often they were met with violence. And frankly, by the late 60s and early 70s, people are getting tired of that kind of divisiveness. So what we're seeing is Nixon's kind of taking hold of that issue, and he promises to, quote, mend the divisiveness in this country, and that would have a lot of implications, and not all positive either. So we're going to see him actually push back against some civil rights measures, such as busing, but trying to reunify the country is one of his main messages. Now, the platform he runs on, he basically will call the New Federalism Program, in which the government, basically kind of has a kind of a return to, and again, this is a very conservative value here, but this idea that the states should be more responsible for what's happening in terms of their laws and their programs. This is the exact opposite of what we've come from. We talked about LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, the last president. He had started up what he called his Great Society program with the war on poverty, and a lot of, massive rise in money for welfare programs, and a lot of conservatives said, we're spending too much. This is not the federal government's role, and so Nixon's kind of holding on to that, saying, we need to return to small government, and these great welfare programs that exist, we need to kind of push those off to the side. They're too expensive, and the states need to handle that themselves. So the next section I want to talk about is improving his platform, what he did to actually get those planks solidified. First of all, we do start to withdraw troops from Vietnam in 1969. We would be present in that country for another 3 years in supporting South Vietnamese until 1975, but ultimately we do end the war. One thing I probably should add to the notes is that, and this is a rightful criticism of Nixon, is that while he did end the war in Vietnam, the war would actually spread to other areas nearby around the same time. We're going to see massive bombing campaigns in countries like Cambodia and Laos, which are neighbors to Vietnam. So, a lot of people who had supported Nixon for pulling us out of the war, criticized Nixon for then kind of extending the war in into other areas. The second plank on the platform, mend the country, and he was very famous for consistently pushing this idea of law and order. Okay, law and order. We're tired of these riots. We're tired of these protests. Let's get back to law and order. And while that may be fine, it all depends on how you do it, right? So frankly, there's a lot of shady things that Nixon is known for, and I would say that some of that falls under this category. He will actively use the FBI to wiretap organizations that he feels are responsible for this divisiveness, including groups like the Black Panthers, and at one point the FBI is even wiretapping Martin Luther King Jr. So again, it all goes, how you go about it is definitely going to be an issue for Nixon. Now, like all politicians, they look forward to the next election, and so right after he gets elected in 1968, he's already looking towards the 1972 election and his possible re-election. And I will tell you right now, Nixon was one of the most nervous presidents, one of the most paranoid presidents we have ever had, and you're going to see that play out later today in terms of some of the actions he takes, and directly leads to Watergate. But looking forward to the 1972 election, what he noticed was in 1968, the Democrats have actually stopped voting, or excuse me, the South has really stopped giving full support for the Democrats. Now that is almost entirely centered around the issue of civil rights. Lyndon Johnson was a big proponent of civil rights. He authored the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He would also sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the Democrats are becoming kind of the party of civil rights, and frankly, that is directly adversely affecting those that hold political power in the South. So by 1968, we're seeing the South really start to end their support for the Democratic Party. And that is something brand new in American history. The Democrats have always had strong support in the South, but that changes here with civil rights. And frankly, the shift has continued to this day. Today, the South still tends to vote in kind of a block, the solid South as they call it. But today they primarily vote Republican, and that is because of what we're discussing right now. The shift happens because of Nixon, and frankly, the parties do kind of make a major shift. You've probably heard that before, that Abraham Lincoln, of course, was a Republican, but would he be a Republican today? I would argue probably no, because the platforms have really completely shifted. Civil rights was a massive moment in American history, and it had a lot of implications. And frankly, what we see is kind of a flip in terms of what the Republicans and Democrats stand for, and that is taking place right here. Now, part of this, I talked about this return to conservatism, the new South, as we're going to call it, that emerges in the 1960s, does feel as if the country has become too liberal, and so we're going to see kind of a push for traditional values there. The election itself, and I'm sorry, I'm going back, this is 1968, and just kind of giving you a visible identification of what the South is doing. You'll notice this election is quite unique because we actually have the presence of a third-party candidate, okay, and that would be George Wallace, who was a huge racist. In fact, he is running for a party called the Dixiecrats, a short-lived third party that, frankly, their platform revolved around anti-civil rights. They are pushing back against a lot of the civil rights programs that have been instituted by the federal government, and they had their own candidate for a couple of elections, never garnering full support enough to actually win the country over, but they tended to win the solid South. So again, Nixon sees this map and he says there's an opportunity there, and so he is going to be courting the Southern people with some of his programs in the future. Now, like I said, he wasn't completely opposed to civil rights, but frankly, we do see him take some steps to push against some of the civil rights legislation that was happening. In particular, there was a program called busing in 1955 when the Supreme Court comes back and says that schools have to integrate now. A lot of them struggled to do that, or just simply refused to do that, as we saw in our civil rights unit. One way that kind of states or the federal government kind of forced those states' hands to integrate was through busing programs, where they would actually bring in minority students that frankly lived sometimes quite far away from the school, just to kind of force this integration to happen. And Nixon opposed that. He said, this is too much. And again, that kind of goes into his whole message of the federal government having too much of a role in people's lives and allowing the states to do more. So he would oppose certain civil rights legislation because of that. Now, one other monumental change that is happening is with the Supreme Court. In his first term, Nixon will replace almost half of the Supreme Court because of death or resignation or retirement. Now, it is worthy of note that he pushed a couple of nominees that were rejected. They were seen as too partisan, wouldn't be a good fit for the Supreme Court. But ultimately, he will place a number of Supreme Court justices that are more conservative. And like I said, this has long-term effects because those who get put on the Supreme Court, it is a life position. So they're going to be there, in some cases, for the next 30 years. The most notable here, William Rehnquist, he would become the Chief Justice, and he would die in the, I believe, early 2000s. So again, 30 years on the court. But the court is definitely going to turn more conservative in the 1970s, and that'll last for the next few decades. Now, one thing Nixon had to deal with was a negative economy. A lot of this dealt with, the backlash of the Vietnam War, but what we see is kind of a weird situation emerge that doesn't usually happen with economics, and that is when both inflation and unemployment rise at the same time. So inflation's doubling in the period that he is president, and unemployment is also rising during this period. So the economists actually come up with a new term that kind of combines these two: stagflation, a stagnant economy while inflation is increasing. these things don't usually happen together, and frankly, it was a sign that our economy might be in trouble. And again, we fought a very expensive war in Vietnam. There's been a lot of frankly, the Great Society program that Johnson pushed was very expensive. Those welfare programs have to be paid through tax dollars. So all of that comes back. It has to be paid for at some point. So let's take a look at the causes of stagflation. I've covered the first two, both very expensive. The third one, and this is kind of shades of something we've seen before, and that is, it's about 20 years after World War II. And what we're starting to see is many of the European nations are getting back on their feet. And some of our former enemies are starting to compete with us in terms of economics. Germany, West Germany. Germany will not be united again until 1990. But West Germany is going to be, their economy is going to be booming during this period. Japan in particular, Japan is going to be, really rivaling America, especially through the 1980s by producing cheap products, cheaper automobiles. This is kind of the beginning of the end for the automobile industry. Detroit has suffered greatly over the last few decades, and part of that story kind of begins here. The fourth reason is because of that baby boomer generation. So, what you had after World War II was a tremendous rise in births in the United States, and what ends up happening is now those former babies are now reaching adulthood, and they can't find jobs. There's more people, but there's just not as many jobs out there. So the result is more unemployment. And the fifth is a topic that is just as important today, and that is oil. Let's take a little bit deeper look at what was happening in the 70s regarding oil. Now, you might be familiar with the term cartel. You always hear about drug cartels, families or, groups that control the production of drugs and can kind of set their own prices. Well, the same thing can be applied to oil as well. A lot of the world's oil comes from the Middle East, and you have a cartel that is formed in the 1970s called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And what ends up happening is in 1973, the United States backs Israel, new nation after World War II, backs Israel, much to the dismay of many of the Arab countries around Israel, and they actually cut off the oil to the United States. And when they ultimately do turn the faucet back on, the prices of oil have quadrupled. That is going to hurt an economy, because it's not just about getting in your car and driving to work. You got to think about all the semis that are delivering goods. You got to think of the ships that use oil, to navigate across the waters and for trade. So this has a tremendously negative effect on our economy. So oil is extremely important during this period, and frankly still remains extremely important today. Now, I put in here as excellent foreign policy. That I should remove that word, because that is obviously in the eye of the beholder. But many people at the time praised Nixon for his foreign policy in terms of looking especially at the Cold War differently. Okay, and I do support this part of it. He hired Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's really responsible for a lot of implementing foreign policy. And Kissinger is not, Kissinger has a lot of critics, and rightfully so. One thing that many people supported, though, was this look he had called realpolitik, where he's, realistic politics. Especially with the Cold War. They looked at situations like Vietnam and they said, okay, let's play out a what-if scenario. What if we never gotten involved in Vietnam? Okay, it would have fallen to communism, we know that. But what would have been the long-term effect for the United States? And men like Kissinger said, probably not much. All right, Vietnam's a poor country. I mean, really didn't have any effect on the U.S. before. Why would you think it would afterwards? But instead, what do? We get involved in a war that costs billions of dollars, tens of thousands of American lives, and is a drain on the economy. So they're saying, let's look at this realistically. You don't just have to jump into any conflict just to stop communism, because that's what all the other presidents have done. Let's maybe look at things realistically. Now, under Nixon, we are going to begin a period of what's called détente, and that's an important term to know, which means an easing, kind of a thawing of tensions during the Cold War. Now, part of this meant actually talking to communist nations, which no president had really done up to that point. In 1972, Nixon's going to travel to China, a communist nation, and no one had ever done this to try and have some friendly relations with communist countries. And, you know, there's definitely a lot of politics going on here because China at this time was not really on the best of terms with the Soviet Union, which was kind of seen as the head, you know, communist nation. So by America courting China and trying to work out, you know, some trade deals, it was kind of also a thorn in the side of Moscow. But Nixon even traveled to Moscow and became the first president to do so. He would meet with the Soviet premier. And in fact, they signed a treaty, which is an excellent treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which they basically said, you know, we don't have to keep this arms race going. Instead, you know, let's limit how many weapons are being produced. And in particular, the intercontinental ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear warheads. Let's go ahead and basically slow down our production of those and make sure that, you know, we're not constantly on the brink of nuclear annihilation. That's a good thing to talk these things out. So more diplomacy, less anger and threats of war. But Nixon would ultimately be remembered as one of the worst presidents for good reason. All of it stems from an event that takes place on June 17, 1972. Again, 72 is an election year, and that is a pivotal part of this story. What ends up happening is there is a break-in. A number of men, 5 guys, get caught breaking into the Democratic National Party. They had their headquarters in an office building called Watergate. And these guys broke into that office building and were planting electronic bugs to listen in on what the Democrats were doing. Now, at first, the break-in makes front-page news, but then it kind of falls to the wayside. Like, oh, the guys got caught, you know, it seems weird, but nobody really makes a big deal of it. Now, the 2 men pictured on the bottom right were 2 journalists for the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Both men said, there's something fishy going on here. You know, why would these guys break into the Democratic National Party? And so they start digging deeper into this issue. Now, in the meantime, the election takes place, and Nixon wins by a landslide, okay? Look at this map. It is all red. In fact, McGovern, the guy he's running against for the Democrats, he doesn't even win his home state. Man, this is the greatest landslide victory, frankly, in American history up until this point. Now, the whole time that, you know, the election's going on, people are focused more on that. Woodward and Bernstein are continuing to investigate this Watergate story. And in fact, they start getting tips from someone involved at a high level of the federal government. And they're, you know, he's kind of feeding them information as to, you know, where to follow, you know, this paper trail or where to follow the money. And ultimately, the stories that get published by Bernstein and Woodward in the Washington Post start leading the public to believe that Nixon may be involved in a cover-up, that there might actually be evidence that those 5 guys who broke into Watergate were actually sent by the White House. And it turns out that that is the case. That is what happened. Now, we don't know exactly what role Nixon had in the actual break-in, but what we absolutely know is that Nixon tried to cover it up. And that is where he went wrong. Instead of admitting the ties here, he did try to cover it up, and that is a felony. So, you know, Nixon, you know, would have some people, some loyal aides on his side that frankly didn't rat him out, but ultimately he does get basically directly linked to these burglars, and that is a bad situation when the President of the United States is directly tied to a felony. So basically, we realize that Nixon's been covering it up. He had ordered documents to be destroyed that had tied him and the White House to this incident. And even the Supreme Court start getting involved, especially once it becomes known that there are secret tapes that Nixon is talking about these. And of course, next thing you know, the tapes, well, they've disappeared. In fact, his secretary accidentally recorded over the tapes. No one's buying it. Nixon. 1974, the House of Representatives draws up impeachment articles. Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Contempt means he's held up the proceedings, and he absolutely had. Now, at this point, this is a big deal to bring up articles of impeachment. At this point, it would shift to the Senate to try Richard Nixon and see if he was guilty of those crimes. He definitely was. In fact, everybody knew it. And instead of going through the embarrassment of being impeached, what Nixon does here is he resigns. He actually gives up the presidency, becoming the very first president to ever resign the position. So, and just to get clarification on this term impeachment, it is technically true to say that Nixon was impeached because the House drew up those impeachment articles and they voted successfully to pass them. So it is correct to say that Nixon was impeached by the House, but he was not fully impeached. Okay? He was not removed. That would have taken a trial by the Senate, and he resigned before that could happen. Very embarrassing moment for the United States. Very embarrassing, of course, for Nixon, what he will always be remembered for. There are, I need to update this slide because obviously with recent events this has changed. But previously there had only been 2 presidents that had been partially impeached. Neither of them had been removed by the Senate. Andrew Johnson, which was the president right after Lincoln, and then Bill Clinton in the 1990s, who was tried for perjury. And once again, the Senate did not choose to remove him at that time. More recently, of course, with President Trump and some of the issues that happened with Ukraine, asking the president of Ukraine to basically investigate his political rival, Joe Biden. Gerald Ford becomes the next president of the United States. He was vice president. Here's your Jeopardy trivia for the day. Gerald Ford is actually the only president to serve in that capacity without having been elected either president or vice president. He had actually been hand-selected. Nixon wasn't really good, I guess, selecting good people to be around because the vice president he had originally selected had to resign as well for tax evasion. Okay, now in reality he was involved in a really big bribery campaign, but basically when the vice presidency got vacated, Nixon chose Gerald Ford, handpicked him to become vice president. Next thing you know, now all of a sudden Gerald Ford is president. Never really wanted to be president. We're going to kind of see that in our next lecture. But, the overall effects of this, the public has completely lost faith in the presidency. All of this is coming at the tail end of Vietnam as well. But man, just overall faith in our government is at an all-time low right here, and rightfully so. It's a sad time for America, and an embarrassing one in terms of us, trying to be a world leader. So next time we will talk about Gerald Ford, and we'll talk about what happened during his short administration. But as always, guys, please email me if you have any questions. I look forward to answering your questions. Bye.